The evening sky over Ouagadougou carried an unusual stillness. Normally alive with laughter, vendors' calls, and the rhythm of daily life, the city seemed hushed, as if awaiting something profound. Whispers had circled for weeks, rumors of a significant meeting between President Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso and the young Nobel Peace Prize laureate, Malala Yousafzai. Few could guess what such an encounter might bring, yet many sensed it would leave an imprint deeper than politics. For Traoré, known for his bold defiance against foreign interference and his firm defense of African dignity, this was not a simple exchange of words. It was almost spiritual, and for Malala, who bore the wounds of violence yet carried with her an unbroken flame of hope, it was not merely about governance or policy. It was a chance to reveal truths about Islam that centuries of distortion had buried. When Malala entered the presidential residence, her quiet presence commanded respect. Modestly dressed, her manner carried humility, yet her voice, soft as it was, held the weight of someone who had faced death and still chosen courage. President Traoré rose at once, extending his hand in a gesture that blended respect with curiosity. Their handshake felt almost familial, as if two distant worlds, South Asia and West Africa, were not strangers, but long-lost relatives destined to meet. The room was tastefully simple, adorned with traditional African art and emblems of resistance. On a polished wooden table lay two sacred texts, the Quran and the Bible. They had been placed side by side deliberately by the president's staff, a symbol that faith in all its forms shaped the destiny of nations. Malala's eyes caught the sight immediately. A small smile formed on her lips as she remarked gently, "This alone is a beginning." By placing these two books together, you show that humanity must seek harmony, not division. The president leaned forward, his expression intense. "You are right, Malala. For too long, people are taught to focus only on what separates us, instead of on the bridges faith can build. But you, who nearly gave your life for the right to education and freedom, you know Islam not as violence, but as peace. That is what I wish to hear. Tell me, what is it that the world most misunderstands about Islam?" Malala's eyes glistened as she began to speak, not from a script, but from her soul. "Mr. President, Islam is not the sword displayed on television screens. It is not the bomb strapped to an extremist, nor the threat shouted by terrorists. Islam means submission, yes, but not to tyranny or injustice. It is surrender to God's will, to justice, to compassion. When I was attacked by the Taliban, they believed they were protecting Islam, but they were far from it. They tried to silence a girl whose only wish was education. Yet the Quran itself begins with the command to read. The very first revelation given to the Prophet Muhammad was to read. How then can education ever be forbidden in Islam? How can ignorance be disguised as faith?" Her words seemed to hang in the air, thick with truth. Traoré closed his eyes briefly, letting them sink deep. "This is powerful," he whispered. "Our people too have been told that Islam is foreign, an imposition from outsiders. Yet Islam has lived in Africa for centuries, and when understood rightly, it aligns with justice, with freedom, with dignity. You remind me that Islam is not against progress. It stands firmly against oppression." Malala nodded, her tone firm. "Exactly. Islam honors knowledge. The Prophet himself urged us to seek wisdom even if we had to travel as far as China. The faith does not restrict the mind, it liberates it. And yet, in today's world, both extremists and the West distort Islam. Extremists manipulate it to dominate, while the West paints it as a threat. Between these two lies the truth, Islam as mercy." The president's voice sharpened, as if he were addressing not only Malala but the entire world. "And what about justice? Here in Africa, we face leaders who invoke religion but crush their people. We battle neo-colonial forces that cloak themselves in scripture while looting our resources. Tell me, Malala, where does Islam stand against such injustice?" Her gaze met his directly, unwavering. "Islam is justice. The Quran commands believers to stand firmly for justice, even if it is against themselves, their families, or their own people. To be Muslim is to be accountable, not only before society, but before God. When a ruler oppresses, he betrays Islam. When a nation silences women, denies children education, or accepts poverty as destiny, it betrays Islam. God has made it clear, He does not change the condition of a people until they change what is within themselves. Justice begins when both leaders and citizens align with truth. The weight of her words pressed heavily upon Traoré. He was a man who had risen through revolution, who had vowed to free Burkina Faso from foreign control. Now, hearing faith intertwined so deeply with justice stirred something inside him. He leaned back slowly, exhaling. What you speak, Malala, is larger than religion. It is a principle for all humanity. Justice is accountability. Africa needs this. For too long, we have let leaders preach while they plunder. For too long, foreign powers have quoted scripture while enslaving nations. Perhaps Islam, as you describe it, is the weapon we need. Not of violence, but of truth. Malala smiled, her eyes soft yet resolute. And let us never forget mercy. The Prophet Muhammad was described as a mercy to all worlds. He was not sent to divide, but to heal. The Quran's compassion extends not only to Muslims, but to neighbors, to strangers, even to enemies. Mercy does not mean weakness. It means strength rooted in principle. The president leaned in, his eyes glowing with intensity. But Malala, how do we balance mercy with resistance? Africa is under siege. Our leaders are assassinated, our nations destabilized, our resources stolen. We cannot simply show mercy while our enemies strip us bare. How does Islam reconcile mercy with defense? Her reply was steady, her voice carrying both gentleness and iron. Islam permits resistance. The Quran allows fighting, but only in self-defense, never aggression. It says clearly, fight in the way of God against those who fight you, but do not transgress. God does not love aggressors. To resist tyranny, to stand against invaders, to fight oppression, this is not just allowed, it is a duty. But it must always be guided by justice, never hatred. Mercy and justice are like two wings of the same bird. They must move together for flight. The room fell into a deep silence. Outside, the city's hum seemed to vanish, as though the night itself leaned in to listen. President Traoré finally broke the silence, his voice low but resolute. You have given me much to reflect on, Malala. I see now that Islam is not just personal faith. It is a structure for governance, for freedom, for dignity. You remind me that knowledge is strength, that mercy is power, and that justice is divine command. Africa needs this. The world needs this. If we return to this essence, perhaps Islam will no longer be seen as a danger, but as a light. Malala leaned closer, her face lit with hope. That is my prayer, Mr. President, that Islam lives not in slogans or in violence, but in practice, through education, through justice, through mercy. Only then will the world understand. Only then will Islam shine as the path to peace it was always meant to be. By then, it was clear that what had begun between Malala and President Traoré was not merely a conversation. It was something greater, souls meeting across continents, building a bridge between South Asia and Africa. A bridge that carried the promise of justice, faith, and truth strong enough to change the course of nations. The night outside deepened, and Ouagadougou's usual rhythm faded into the distance. Inside the residence, however, the air felt strangely alive, as though the exchange between Malala and President Traoré had awakened something larger than themselves. What had begun as a dialogue about faith had now expanded into a profound reflection on justice, leadership, and humanity's future. The president signaled for tea to be served, a gesture of African hospitality. He poured the steaming drink himself, offering a cup to Malala. She accepted with gratitude, holding it carefully, reminded of home. The taste and warmth recalled the tea traditions of Pakistan, and she smiled quietly. Oceans and cultures apart, she thought, and yet here they sat, connected by rituals that spoke the same language of belonging. Traoré's gaze was thoughtful as he sipped his cup. Malala, you said earlier that knowledge liberates. Here in Africa, we have schools, universities, and programs. And yet ignorance continues to thrive. Our curriculums are too often shaped by foreign influence, training our children to serve others instead of themselves. How then do we transform education into a true weapon for freedom, not merely a path to jobs? Malala's eyes lit with conviction. Education is not just about earning certificates. It is about awakening the mind. When I fight for girls' education, it isn't only so they can read or write. It is so they can think, question, and create. The Quran urges us to seek knowledge endlessly. The Prophet Muhammad once said, "The ink of the scholar is more sacred than the blood of the martyr." Imagine the power of those words. He placed learning above sacrifice. True education is not about producing workers. It is about producing souls that know who they are. The president's head dipped in agreement, his face solemn. Yes, our colonizers trained clerks to manage their empires, not thinkers who could liberate Africa. They raised servants, not leaders. What you describe is the education we desperately need, a teaching that does not enslave the soul but frees it. Malala smiled gently. That is also Islam. It is not narrow or closed, but vast and open. Islam commands believers to reflect on creation, to search for knowledge in science, philosophy, and the arts. Islam does not fear modernity. It only rejects injustice. If Africa and the Muslim world embrace this understanding of education, no empire can dominate us. Because the truest freedom is the freedom of the mind. Her words seemed to stir something fierce within Traoré. He leaned back, his voice rising with conviction. Then the real jihad is not only against foreign armies or corrupt rulers, it is against ignorance. It is the struggle to wake up our people, to remind them they are not victims but inheritors of a divine mission. Malala's tone sharpened with passion. Yes, that is the jihad Islam calls us to. The inner struggle, the fight against injustice, the pursuit of knowledge. Extremists have twisted this word, turning it into a weapon of blood. But jihad is as much about building schools as defending borders. It is as much about feeding the hungry as resisting invaders. That is the Islam I live. That is the Islam I nearly died for. Silence followed, heavy and meaningful. They both sipped their tea slowly, letting the weight of her words fill the space. After a pause, the president's voice softened. Tell me something, Malala. You have lived in the West, you have been honored there, celebrated even, and yet you still defend Islam so fiercely. Many young Muslims who leave their homelands feel ashamed of their faith. Some abandon it completely, but you remain steadfast. Why? Her expression shifted, touched by memory. Because I have seen both sides. I have seen extremists in my own country misuse Islam to deny me education, and I have seen people in the West misuse freedom to mock my religion. Both tried to define me. Yet in my darkest moment, when I lay in the hospital after being shot, I found comfort in the Quran's words. Do not despair of God's mercy. Islam never abandoned me. It gave me hope when both East and West had failed me. That is why I defend it, because Islam is not the Taliban, nor is it Western prejudice. It is surrender to God. And in that surrender is the greatest freedom. The president listened intently, his respect deepening with each word. You speak with wisdom far beyond your years, Malala. Africa needs voices like yours. Our young people must learn that Islam is not weakness but strength, not violence but peace, not oppression but liberation. Malala leaned forward, her tone almost urgent. And Africa can lead the way, Mr. President. Do you realize the power you hold? If Africa reclaims Islam in its true essence, justice, mercy, knowledge, it can inspire the entire Muslim world. Too long have others defined Islam for us. Too long has it been used as a tool for power. But Africa can show the world that Islam is not about empire. It is about humanity. Traoré's voice grew fierce, his words carrying the weight of defiance. And that is precisely what they fear. They fear an Africa that is educated, united, and rooted in faith. They fear an Islam that speaks truth to power. That is why they assassinate our leaders. That is why they destabilize our nations. Because they know that if Africa combines justice with faith, we cannot be stopped. Malala nodded gravely. Yes, that is the history of all prophets, all reformers. The powerful always fear truth. But the Quran reminds us that truth always rises, even when falsehood tries to drown it. The question is not whether we will face opposition. The question is whether we will remain firm. Traoré's eyes clouded as he thought of Africa's past. Sankara, Lumumba, Gaddafi, leaders who dared to resist global powers and paid the price. Yet Malala's words stirred conviction. Greatness was not measured by avoiding struggle, but by enduring it with principle. He looked back at her, his gaze sharp with resolve. Then we must prepare a new generation. One that learns Islam not through propaganda, but through truth. One that values education, justice, and mercy. A generation unafraid of the West, but ready to face it with dignity. Malala, Africa will rise, and Islam will rise with it. Malala's voice softened, almost like a prayer. And may that rising not be for Muslims alone, but for all humanity. For the Quran says, "We created you into nations and tribes so that you may know one another, not despise one another." Diversity itself is God's will. If Africa rises with this spirit, it will not only free itself, but help heal the world. The room grew silent again, broken only by the faint clinking of teacups as they set them down. Outside, faint drumbeats echoed in the distance. the heartbeat of a continent on the move. Traoré spoke once more, his voice steady with newfound clarity. Malala, tonight you have changed me. I came seeking answers about Islam, but I leave with a vision for Africa. We must free not only our land, but also our minds, our faith, our future. Islam, as you describe it, is not a burden. It is a light. Her eyes shone with hope as she leaned forward. Then carry that light, Mr. President. Let it shine not only in mosques, but in schools, in governments, in every home. For Islam is not confined to rituals. It is lived through justice, compassion, and truth. That is the Islam the world needs to see. That is the Islam I have given my life for. And perhaps that is the Islam Africa will now rise to lead. Their conversation ended without ceremony, only with an unspoken understanding. Two individuals, one from South Asia, one from West Africa, had woven together a vision of Islam that shattered stereotypes and crossed borders. It was not the Islam distorted by extremists, nor the Islam misrepresented by critics. It was the Islam of knowledge, mercy, and justice. And as night slowly gave way to dawn, Ouagadougou awoke to a new day, unaware that within the walls of the presidential residence, a dialogue had taken place that could shape the course of history. Those who would hear of it later would agree on one thing. What Malala Yousafzai had told President Ibrahim Traoré about Islam did not just influence him. It held the power to influence the world,